He was great, wasn't he? Yeah, Mr. Perfect, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, with a host of other wrestlers that we'll try to touch base on today. I don't want to make this too long of a video, but I've been meaning to do this video for a while. It is something that is very near and dear to my heart, and a lot of you guys probably may not be even aware, but back in the day when I was growing up, wrestling was a big part of my life. So let's get started. I'll take a sip of my wine before we get started, and then we'll get right into it. So, in a way, I'm kind of lucky that I was born in '83 because by the time I was about 6, 7, 8 years old, just getting out of the '80s and just getting into the '90s, and in my opinion, in my humble opinion, that was probably the greatest era as far as watching wrestling is concerned. Of course, there's the Attitude Era as well. We'll get into that in a few minutes, but I started watching wrestling, I want to say around 1988. I know I was only 5 years old, but I do remember watching it. 88, 89. And around that time, it was very much like what Bret Hart would refer to as, his book that he came up with a couple years ago there, My Real Life in Cartoon Wrestling. Well, a lot of the wrestlers, you watched it on TV, those wrestlers from the 80s, it was almost like watching a cartoon, the personalities that they had. Obviously, it's not like that today. And that carried on right through the early 90s as well. I remember it's hard for me to really do this video without, doing proper research. I'm doing this on the fly, so forgive me if I can't remember everything. But I just remember the early 90s. Yeah, of course, there was Hulk Hogan. But even bigger than Hulk Hogan, around 1990-91 was the Ultimate Warrior. He was like the next big thing. He was so popular, everybody was like, Hulk Hogan. He became more popular than Hulk Hogan. And then obviously around 92-93 with the unveil, was that the survival series? I can't remember. The Undertaker, that was huge as well. It was just huge. The Undertaker was like one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. I can remember one of the things that really grabbed me as a young child watching wrestling was back then. Again, a lot of you guys may not, this might sound crazy, but back then it felt real. You were watching almost like a soap opera for men. The storylines felt real. Again, I'm like 8 years old, 9 years old, so for me to watch that, it really pulled me in. I can remember, watching a lot of the tag teams. You had the Rockers, which of course was Marty Jannetty and Shawn Michaels, and the Legion of Doom, which was always a weird one for me because they always had more than two guys. They always had the main pay-per-view events throughout the year. They had like the Royal Rumble, which is my favorite. They had, again, Survival Series, obviously WrestleMania. And then later on, they had newer shows they added to the roster, like In Your House and a host of other ones as well. It can't be said enough. Probably my two favorite wrestlers of all time would be, again, Curt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, and Bret the Hitman Hart. Two of the most technically proficient wrestlers in the history of the sport. If you get a chance, there is a match between Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect, and those guys basically fed off each other for the whole match. You watch it, it's poetry in motion, just the technical skills involved, and that's why if you read Bret Hart's book, he talks about how, Hulk Hogan, as big of a wrestling superstar that he was in the 80s, he really wasn't a good wrestler. He just wasn't. He had the atomic leg drop. Obviously, he had the off the turnbuckle, with his arm. And then obviously to a lesser extent, I think Randy Savage doesn't get enough credit. At least he was flying off the top turnbuckle and he was doing a lot of stuff as well. But to me, Bret Hart, when he talked on the mic, although obviously wrestling's fake, when he talked on the mic, it felt real. And the same goes for a lot of these other guys as well. Again, Mr. Perfect. We had obviously the Repo Man, Yokozuna. We had Giant Gonzalez. We had Duke the Dumpster Drozy. Who else? Brooklyn Brawler. So there was a lot of wrestlers back then that were main attractions. I can remember specifically, it had to have been like a Saturday morning because back then they had Saturday morning wrestling. And I'm sitting there on the ground, on the carpet in my house watching wrestling. And at that point, obviously, the Rockers were like the next big thing. They were like the biggest tag team. They were right up there with the Hart Foundation. And basically, Brutus the Barber Beefcake, he had this segment where it was the barbershop. And I could just remember as a kid seeing Shawn Michaels do his patented super kick to Marty Jannetty, and Marty Jannetty goes right through the barbershop window. To me, I couldn't believe that when I saw that. It literally looked so real. It looked like this guy just went through a glass window. It was horrifying to see. I couldn't believe it. And that was a pivotal moment for Shawn Michaels' career. That was when he basically got put over as a mainstay, like a huge superstar. And obviously Marty Jannetty kind of went his own way. But obviously Shawn Michaels, what else can be said about that guy? He was technically proficient as well. I can remember watching a match. I think it was Survival Series as well. I could be wrong. It was Razor Ramon versus Shawn Michaels, and it was the first ever ladder match of all time. I think it might have been Razor's idea. And man, that match, if you guys get a chance to watch that match, at one point the ladder ends up getting kind of warped from them using it on each other so much. And I don't think it was part of the show for the ladder to do that. And Shawn Michaels climbed the ladder to grab the belt, and then Razor would pull the ladder down, and then Razor would climb up. And I think at the end of it, I think Razor won that match. Obviously, Scott Hall, a lot of personal demons with that guy as well. Razor Ramon was one of my favorite wrestlers as well. For me, it wasn't so much the wrestling as it was watching the storylines and watching a lot of these guys cut these promos. Like, obviously, Mr. Perfect, you see that promo there. He was so coordinated. How many other wrestlers would have the confidence to flick a pen in the air and then catch it on live TV? Like, absolutely perfect. The way he would toss his towel behind his back and catch it with his other hand. Or he'd spit his gum out and he'd swat it with his hand. Again, I know I talk a lot about Mr. Perfect, but man, he was phenomenal. He had some of the best promos. There was one where he actually threw a football, and then the way they filmed it was that they made it look like he ran down the football field and caught his own throw. It was just absolutely perfect. It was amazing. So yeah, I watched wrestling throughout the 90s, and then obviously towards 96, 97, still we have a lot of these superstars from the 80s, Tatanka, Kamala, and all the rest of them, Big Boss Man. And I can remember too in the early 90s, around 93, I'd see this other promotion on TV. How are we doing for time here? 8 minutes? WCW. And I can remember seeing that, and it looks so low budget on TV compared to the WWF at the time, which is now the WWE. And I can remember, I still watched it. I remember seeing Stunning Steve Austin, who's obviously now Stone Cold Steve Austin. Sting was on there. So there was a lot of wrestlers that were, staples on the WCW scene that eventually kind of made their way over to the WWF when Vince purchased and acquired the WCW from what was his name there, Ted Turner. So there's only so much I can talk about in this video. Obviously, we're pressed for time, but yeah, WCW was all right. I was still a huge fan of the WWF. Monday Night Raw, I think that came out around 93, 94, and that's exactly what it was. Every Monday night, we would all turn into Raw, and it was raw and uncut. You didn't know what was going to happen. It was like live TV, and all the crazy shit happened on Monday Night Raw. It was Raw as War is what they called it, and then they changed it to Monday Night Raw. And for a while there, it was like, you'd be Wednesday or Thursday during the week, and you couldn't wait for Monday to come because Monday night was like Monday Night Raw. It was the best thing. And towards 96, 97, obviously we get the Attitude Era, and that was good and bad in a way, because as awesome as it was to watch that and watch those feuds, it was kind of turning the page, leaving the old style of wrestling behind, the cartoon wrestling, and then you get this Attitude Era where it was even more storyline driven, and it was even more kind of provocative, and you're seeing like women that are kind of like half naked on TV, and Stone Cold's coming out doing a beer bash with the Budweiser truck, and Booker T and Goldust are getting into a fight in the supermarket with Stone Cold, and all the rest of it. So I really enjoyed watching a lot of those old promos, and I found a channel recently on YouTube, believe it or not, and the guy actually, I don't know how he gets away with it. He's got 2-hour episodes of WWF from the 80s throughout the 90s. It's like literally you can go back and watch it just like you would have watched it back in the day in 2-hour videos on YouTube. Obviously, it's like VHS quality recording, but still, it's pretty cool to go back and watch a lot of those old tapes. And again, I loved watching the wrestlers, cut their promos. For me, as far as some of the best promos of all time, again, Bret Hart. Randy Savage was one. He cut some amazing promos, like just unbelievable. The Ultimate Warrior, as weird as his promos were, they were pretty genius as well. Obviously, Stone Cold, you got that classic, coming out of his shell there, where he beat Jake the Snake Roberts, and then he talked about how, Jake the Snake, he's thumping his Bible. The Bible says Austin 3:16 just whooped your ass, and drinking your Thunderbird, and he goes on that huge rant. That basically ended Jake the Snake's career, and that's where Stone Cold's career sort of took off. So yeah, lots of great memories. Unfortunately, I stopped watching wrestling towards the early 2000s. I picked it up around 2010, 11. I started watching it again, but I could never really get into it again. It's just never quite been the same for me. But yeah, lots of great memories. There's only so much again that I can talk about in this video. But again, I will say this: if you do get the chance to watch again some of those older matches, especially with Bret Hart, Razor Ramon, Diesel, Mr. Perfect, even Lex Luger to a certain extent, Plexi Lexi. A lot of these matches were again very technical. Even Bam Bam Bigelow, for as big of a man as he was pretty incredible to watch in the squared circle as well. And there's just so many great memories. I can remember Lex Luger versus Mr. Perfect, and Lex Luger was called the Narcissist, so it was the Narcissist versus Mr. Perfect. I remember Lex Luger was then changed to the All-American. I remember they had a match on Pearl Harbor where he suplexed Yokozuna, and I can remember, I think it was the Ultimate Warrior, one time he had to get ready for a match against The Undertaker, who was just hot on the scene. And they were putting out these awesome, I think they call them vinaigrettes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Where like the Ultimate Warrior was like locked in a room full of like snakes. And there was a casket, and he was getting all freaked out. And Paul Bearer was there. And I think one time, I can't remember who The Undertaker was fighting, but he did throw somebody into a casket. And they were basically rest in peace from that point. Undertaker versus Undertaker, that was another cool match. Obviously, Skydome WrestleMania 1990, very famous as well. So yeah, just a host of memories. And I know this was supposed to be a wrestling / video game video. That's why I've kind of showed some of the game screenshots as I've went along throughout this video. I think personally the best wrestling game was probably WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, because just the type of sprites that they used in that game, where it was kind of like full motion video kind of graphics, kind of like Mortal Kombat at the time, Midway and Acclaim. That game, I remember playing that in the arcade, and that was a really good game. A lot of the other wrestling games, they're hit or miss. There's some really good WCW wrestling games on the N64 and the original PlayStation as well. So yeah, like I said, huge wrestling fan. I went to a wrestling event in 1995 as well, a house show up in Ottawa, Canada. I can't remember who was on the card, but I'll have to look that up as well. But anyways, yeah, wrestling was a huge part of my life growing up. I know this video's not for everybody. Not everybody's a wrestling fan, but I hope you can appreciate it. And share your wrestling memories down below. Obviously, a lot of wrestlers over the years have passed away, which is unfortunate, but their memories live on. So that's going to do it, guys. Again, thank you so much for watching. Appreciate it. You guys have a great day. Take care.